Imagine a single moment, one city, one battle, where the course of history fractures into an entirely different reality. Winter, 1941. The German Wehrmacht stands at the gates of Moscow. Snow falls like ash. Soviet defenses are collapsing. And this time, there is no last-minute bus. This is not the history you know. This is what happens if Moscow falls. The year is 1941. Operation Barbarossa has already torn through the Western Soviet Union like a storm of steel. Entire armies have been encircled. Millions of Soviet soldiers are dead, wounded, or captured. Cities like Minsk, Smolensk, and Kiev have fallen in rapid succession. The German war machine appears unstoppable. But in our timeline, something changes. The rains come earlier. The mud, Rasputitsa, doesn't slow the Germans as much. Supply lines hold just long enough. And most critically, Hitler does not divert his armored divisions south toward Kiev. Instead, he listens to his generals, for once, and pushes everything toward Moscow. This single decision alters everything. By October, German Army Group Center is still intact, still powerful, still moving. Soviet resistance is fierce, but disorganized. Stalin hesitates too long. Panic spreads through Moscow. Government ministries begin evacuating eastward, but the process is chaotic. And then, November 1941, the Germans reach the outskirts of Moscow. Moscow is not just another city. It is the beating heart of the Soviet Union. It is the political center, the communications hub, the symbolic core of Soviet resistance. Railways radiate from it like arteries. Orders flow through it. Without Moscow, coordination across the vast Soviet territory becomes exponentially harder. And in this alternate reality, Moscow falls. Street fighting erupts across the capital. Soviet troops, NKVD units, civilians, everyone fights. But German forces, hardened by months of offensive warfare, push relentlessly forward. The Kremlin is captured. The red flag falls. And the swastika rises over Moscow. The psychological impact is immediate and devastating. Across the Soviet Union, shock waves ripple. The myth of invincibility shatters. Stalin, who in real history stayed in Moscow during its darkest hour, now faces a different decision. Does he stay and risk capture? Or does he flee? In this scenario, Stalin evacuates to Kuibyshev, modern-day Samara. The Soviet government survives, but its legitimacy is shaken. Rumors spread that the leadership abandoned the capital. Morale plummets. Some Soviet commanders begin to question whether the war can still be won. Others consider surrender, but the Soviet Union does not collapse overnight. This is critical. Even without Moscow, the USSR remains vast. Its industry is already being relocated east of the Urals. Siberia still produces resources. Millions of soldiers remain under arms. However, coordination becomes a nightmare. Rail networks are disrupted. Communication lines are fragmented. Strategic planning becomes slower, less efficient, more reactive. And Germany exploits this. With Moscow in German hands, the Wehrmacht gains a massive logistical advantage. Railways that once fed Soviet resistance now serve German supply lines. Troops can be moved more efficiently across the front. The central position allows Germany to strike north toward Leningrad or south toward the Caucasus with greater flexibility. The Eastern Front begins to stabilize, not as a desperate German gamble, but as a controlled expansion. And then comes 1942. In real history, 1942 saw Germany overextend toward Stalingrad and the Caucasus, ultimately leading to catastrophe. But in this alternate timeline, the situation is different. With Moscow secured, Germany does not need to gamble everything on a single southern offensive. Instead, it consolidates. Leningrad, already under siege, is now completely cut off. Without Moscow as a logistical backbone, Soviet efforts to relieve the city weaken. By mid-1942, Leningrad falls. The symbolic losses are staggering. Moscow, Leningrad, two pillars of Soviet identity, gone. Meanwhile, in the south, German forces advance toward the oil fields of the Caucasus with more preparation, better supply lines, and stronger reserves. Stalingrad still becomes a battlefield, but not the same one. Without the desperation of a collapsing front, the Soviets cannot concentrate overwhelming force there. The city may still resist, but it lacks the strategic importance it had in our timeline. Instead of a decisive Soviet encirclement, the battle becomes a grinding stalemate, one that Germany is better positioned to sustain. Now, consider the global implications. The United States has entered the war after Pearl Harbor. Britain continues to fight. But without a strong Soviet counteroffensive, the pressure on Germany is reduced. There is no massive German defeat at Stalingrad, no turning point in 1943, no rapid Soviet push westward. Instead, the Eastern Front becomes a prolonged war of attrition, with Germany holding key strategic positions. This changes Allied strategy. Without the Soviet Union gaining momentum, the Western Allies face a terrifying question. Can Germany be defeated at all? D-Day becomes far riskier. Opening a second front in France without a collapsing Eastern Front means facing a stronger, more concentrated German defense. The invasion might be delayed, or it might fail. Meanwhile, Nazi Germany consolidates its control over Eastern Europe. Occupied territories become more entrenched under brutal administration. Resources are extracted more efficiently. Forced labor expands, and the ideological war intensifies. This is not just about territory. It is about a vision of the world. But even in this darker timeline, Germany's victory is not guaranteed. Because conquest is not the same as control. The Soviet Union, though wounded, is not dead. Partisan warfare explodes across occupied territories. Supply lines are sabotaged. German forces are stretched thin trying to maintain order over vast, hostile lands. Winter still comes. Always. And the deeper Germany pushes, the more it faces the same fundamental problem. Distance. Logistics become the silent enemy. Fuel shortages persist. Equipment wears down. Replacement troops are less experienced. The longer the war drags on, the more Germany's initial advantages erode. And then there is industry. The Soviet factories beyond the Urals continue producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons. The Red Army rebuilds slower, less coordinated, but still relentless. The war transforms from lightning war to grinding survival. By 1944, the world is locked in a brutal stalemate. Germany controls Moscow, Leningrad, and vast swaths of Soviet territory. But it cannot fully destroy the Soviet Union. The Soviets cannot easily reclaim their lost lands. And the Western Allies are still searching for a decisive breakthrough. This becomes a war without a clear end. Now imagine the long-term consequences. A divided Eurasia. A fortified German empire stretching deep into the east. A Soviet state pushed beyond the Urals, battered but alive. A Cold War that looks nothing like the one we know. Perhaps instead of the United States and the Soviet Union, it becomes the United States versus Nazi Germany. Technology accelerates under pressure. Jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, even nuclear weapons. In this alternate timeline, who gets the bomb first? If Germany, with its expanded resources and time, succeeds, the balance of power shifts dramatically. A nuclear-armed Nazi regime would redefine global politics in unimaginable ways. And what of ideology? A German victory in Moscow would embolden fascist movements worldwide. Neutral countries might align with Germany. Resistance movements might lose hope. The moral landscape of the 20th century changes. Democracy itself faces a far greater threat. But history is rarely decided by a single victory, even one as massive as Moscow. Because wars are systems, complex, interconnected, unpredictable. And while capturing Moscow would have been a seismic event, it would not have guaranteed ultimate victory. So what is the real answer? If Hitler had conquered Moscow, the war would have been longer, deadlier, more uncertain, and far, far darker. But not necessarily one. Because in the end, the same forces remain: overextension, logistics, industrial capacity, human resilience, and the simple, brutal truth that occupying land is easier than controlling it. Moscow could have fallen, but the war? the war would have continued. And that is what makes this question so haunting. Not that everything would change instantly, but that everything would become more dangerous, more unstable, and more unpredictable. A world balanced on a knife's edge, where victory is never certain, and survival is never guaranteed. This was the moment that could have changed everything. And yet, even then, history refuses to be simple. What do you think? Would the fall of Moscow have ended the war?